Every single morning, before the world even finds its rhythm, a single number quietly flickers onto the screens of 3,700,000,000 people. It's not a currency, yet it dictates the value of every dollar on earth. It's not a government, yet it wields more influence than the outcome of a presidential election. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, a mathematical formula once dismissed as a mere numbers game, now serves as the $53 trillion anchor for global wealth. But here is the truth hidden in plain sight. The genetic code of our global economy wasn't written in a high-rise boardroom in Manhattan. It began with the calloused hands of a poor farm boy from rural Connecticut. Charles Dow, a man who was shut out of college because he couldn't afford a single cent for tuition, entered the world of finance with zero family connections. He didn't rely on a trust fund. He relied on the grit of a carpenter who once hauled heavy timber for less than $8 a week. Charles Dow didn't just invent a calculation. He liberated information from the grip of the elite and single-handedly built the entire intellectual infrastructure of modern capitalism as we know it today. His perspective was forged in the silver mines of Leadville, Colorado, where he witnessed firsthand how financiers manipulated rumors to create artificial booms, leaving ordinary investors in ruin. A lesson that convinced him the world desperately needed an honest yardstick for value. Consider the landscape before Dow's revolution. Stock prices were literally scrawled by hand in chalk on large blackboards, often hours or days out of date. Critical market intelligence traveled at the speed of the fastest horse or steam engine. The average citizen was totally blind to the true financial health of major companies. Wall Street was not an accessible market. It was an impenetrable secret society, an exclusive fraternity where only the insiders operating on whispers and private ledgers were guaranteed to profit. Today, every instrument of financial security, your retirement account, your company pension, your 401k plan, all of it traces its lineage directly back to this one man's desperately revolutionary insight. The world's wealthiest titans, Bezos, Musk, Gates, have their fortunes quantified and measured using systems Charles Dow pioneered. When global markets experience flash crashes, wiping out trillions in minutes, the panic unfolds according to predictable patterns Dow was the first to rigorously identify. Even when your grandmother checks the value of her mutual fund on her smartphone, she is interacting with a technology and a core concept that began with Dow's painstakingly handwritten financial newsletters. To understand how a man with bloody hands and an aching back built the central nervous system of global wealth, we must travel back to where the silence was loudest. We must return to a farm in Connecticut, where the first cracks in the financial aristocracy's wall were quietly formed. But the real story of how a penniless carpenter became the architect of modern finance is far darker and more complex than a simple tale of genius or luck. It is a chronicle of weaponized information, fueled by the terrifying, desperate power wielded by those who control the narrative in a world starved for objective truth. What Dow uncovered about market psychology, the predictable forces of human greed, and the hidden mechanisms that truly drive capital accumulation, represents a knowledge base that the established financial powers have actively attempted to suppress for well over a century. This is the narrative of how one man's raw instinct for survival ultimately laid the foundation for a system that now sustains, or starves, the entire global economy. It is the story of how a struggling journalist's relentless quest for the truth, his simple drive to track stock prices with integrity, gave birth to the mathematical language used by every trader, investor, and central bank on the planet. You may think you understand how markets function, but you are about to discover you know nothing at all. Because today, his silent legacy doesn't just influence, it dominates every single financial transaction on Earth. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, closing this afternoon at whatever figure the ticker displays, represents the collective pulsating value of America's largest corporations. When it plummets 500 points, ordinary retirement accounts instantly lose billions. When it soars, the most expensive champagne flows across corporate boardrooms from Manhattan to Tokyo. The entire complex rhythm of global commerce beats to the pulse of Dow's ingenious creation. Yet Charles Henry Dow began with absolute nothing. Born November 6, 1851 in Connecticut, he was raised on a subsistence farm that perpetually hovered on the brink of ruin. His father died when Charles was just 6 years old, leaving his widowed mother to work herself to the point of collapse, merely to keep food on the table. There was no money, no connections, and no trust fund waiting in the wings. At age 21, Dow was a carpenter. His hands were perpetually calloused and often bloody. His back constantly ached under the strain of heavy timber. At that time, Wall Street might as well have been on another planet. The biggest aspiration for this physically exhausted young man was simply to one day own a small farm of his own. However, instead of accepting a fate of manual labor or selling his blood like other destitute youths might, Dow decided to sell his words. He landed a job at the Springfield Daily Republican. It was here that he mastered a crisp, factual writing style, the very thing that would later define the language of the entire Wall Street financial world. Dow possessed a quality more valuable than any inheritance, an unrelenting, obsessive need to understand the underlying mechanics of how the world really worked. While his fellow carpenters focused solely on surviving the day, Dow spent his evenings voraciously reading every available newspaper, determined to decode a business world that was being deliberately obscured. He noticed immediately that newspaper stock reports were a confusing, contradictory mess, often fundamentally incorrect. Prices varied wildly between different publications. No one seemed to have a credible, verifiable idea of what any company was actually worth. What most people fail to grasp is that during the 1870s, financial information was not just scarce, it was deliberately kept secret. Wall Street operated as a strict, exclusive gentlemen's club, where insiders traded primarily on private, privileged knowledge, while the masses of ordinary, hopeful investors were left dangerously blind. Stock prices were rarely published with regularity. Company earnings were hidden behind vague summaries. Trading occurred in smoke-filled private rooms where vast fortunes were made and instantly lost, based on whispered, unsubstantiated rumors. This control was not just about monetary gain. It was about absolute power. The men who controlled the flow of information controlled everything. They could effortlessly manipulate prices, financially crush competitors, and build vast, entrenched monopolies because the public had no mechanism whatsoever to verify the real state of affairs. The existing financial newspapers were, in essence, thinly disguised propaganda sheets financed by the wealthy investors themselves who used them to disseminate favorable lies and inflated claims about their own holdings. Dow saw something profound that everyone else missed. Whoever could provide accurate, objective, and unbiased financial information would hold unprecedented power. Not the power to manipulate markets, but the far more transformative power to expose manipulation. He realized that in a world structured entirely on secrets and chicanery, the person who committed to telling the truth would instantly become indispensable. Beneath the carpenter's humble, physically exhausted exterior lay a mind that processed complex data like a sophisticated machine. Dow could read a company's sparse financial statement and instantly spot critical inconsistencies that escaped the notice of Harvard-trained bankers. He understood that stock prices were not merely random fluctuations. They were a measurable, predictable reflection of deeper patterns of human behavior, economic cycles, and mass psychology. This conviction was not about personal wealth accumulation. It was about the democratization of capital. Dow deeply believed that if ordinary working people were given access to the exact same high-quality information as Wall Street insiders, they could compete on genuinely equal terms. He imagined a future where a modest grandmother in rural Kansas could execute sophisticated investment decisions based on the same verified data available to J.P. Morgan in his lavish Manhattan office. The transformation from impoverished carpenter to financial revolutionary was slow, painful, and fraught with peril. It required Dow to abandon everything safe and familiar, move to a monstrous city where he knew no one, and directly challenge the most powerful men in America, men who had billions of reasons to brutally destroy anyone who dared to threaten their profitable information monopoly. But before he could conquer Wall Street, Dow needed a crash course in raw capitalism. In 1879, he joined a group of tycoons and geologists on a 4-day train ride to Leadville, Colorado, to cover the silver mining boom. It was here, amidst the saloons and gambling halls, that he wrote his famous Leadville letters. He observed not just the geology of the Rockies, but the psychology of the financiers, learning exactly how insiders manipulated information to create and destroy fortunes overnight. This trip didn't just give him a story, it gave him the blueprint of how the smart money actually operated. Leadville wasn't just a journalistic assignment, it was the final piece of the puzzle. It revealed to Dow that the chaos in the Rockies was merely a microcosm of a much larger, more infectious disease rotting the heart of American finance. What he witnessed in the dusty saloons of Colorado was a scheme being played out on a national stage where the stakes were no longer just about lost silver, but the systemic collapse of an entire nation's hope. But in 1879, a devastating event occurred that would galvanize Dow's life forever. A brutal financial panic ripped through America, instantly wiping out fortunes and destroying countless lives. Banks collapsed rapidly. Companies vanished overnight. Millions of ordinary Americans lost their life savings because they possessed absolutely no mechanism to foresee the impending crisis. The wealthy elite, conversely, had been quietly transferring their assets to safety for months. Dow watched this unfolding disaster with escalating fury. He realized the financial chaos was not merely bad luck or random volatility. It was a deliberate, engineered event. The same insiders who triggered the panic had profusely profited from it, using their massive information asymmetry to rob millions of Americans blind. He knew with absolute certainty that without someone committed to leveling the playing field, this systematic theft would continue to repeat itself indefinitely. Let me take you back to that pivotal, defining moment, the instant a 28-year-old carpenter made a decision that would permanently reshape global capitalism. Charles Dow's story begins with hunger. Real, gnawing, physical hunger, the kind that cramps your stomach for days and leaves you dizzy and lightheaded when you stand up too quickly. It was the brutal winter of 1872, and the 21-year-old carpenter was surviving primarily on stale bread and water in a cramped, frigid boarding house in Springfield, Massachusetts. Dow hadn't chosen carpentry as an ambition. He had fallen into it out of sheer necessity. His family desperately needed money, and building rough barns paid slightly better than endless farm labor. But carpentry in 1870s New England was a relentless, punishing profession. 10-hour days spent in freezing weather, hauling heavy timber with crude, primitive tools, earning perhaps $8 a week if he was extraordinarily lucky. Most carpenters were too physically exhausted after work to do anything but drink cheap liquor and collapse into sleep. Dow was the anomaly. Every evening, while his exhausted fellow workers staggered toward the nearest tavern, he walked the frozen streets to the Springfield Public Library and stayed there, reading until the librarians forcibly ejected him at closing time. He devoured not just the local papers, but dense financial publications imported from Boston and New York, specialized trade journals, and complex business magazines that most college graduates would have struggled to comprehend. What truly captivated him was not the sensational stories themselves, but the glaring, frustrating contradictions. The Springfield Republican would proclaim that railroad stocks were soaring toward the heavens, while the rival Boston Globe simultaneously reported the exact same stocks were crashing toward zero. The New York Herald would lavish praise on companies that the Wall Street Journal viciously condemned. Either these established publications were profoundly incompetent, or someone was actively, deliberately lying. Dow suspected both. Here is the key insight. Dow was not reading these papers trying to get rich. He was driven by a genuine intellectual curiosity about how information, this abstract commodity, actually flowed through society. Why did the news about the exact same economic event vary so dramatically between competing publications? Who held the power to decide what information was trustworthy? And why did the already wealthy always seem to know critical things, weeks or months, before everyone else? His breakthrough came during the devastating panic of 1873, one of the most violent financial crises in American history. Banks collapsed across the country. The New York Stock Exchange was forced to close for an unprecedented 10 days. Unemployment tragically soared to 14%. But here was the appalling truth. While ordinary citizens were economically devastated and ruined, certain named wealthy individuals actually managed to substantially increase their fortunes during the ensuing chaos. For a man earning a mere $8 a week through grueling physical labor, this realization was a profound, systemic shock. It wasn't just unfair. It was a calculated betrayal of the working class. This indignation became his fuel. It was the reason he didn't just read, but obsessively cross-referenced every scrap of data, losing himself in the archives until the flickering lamps of the library were the only thing left between him and the dark. Dow spent countless hours in the library, meticulously cross-referencing newspaper reports with actual stock price movements, desperate to understand how this perverse outcome was possible. What he finally discovered shocked him to his core. The financial elite hadn't merely predicted the crash, they had covertly helped cause it, and then strategically positioned themselves to ruthlessly profit when everything violently collapsed. The entire mechanism relied on total information control. Wealthy investors would disseminate false glowing optimism through financial newspapers they controlled, encouraging naive, ordinary people to buy stocks at massively inflated prices. Meanwhile, these same insiders were quietly, methodically selling off their own entire holdings. When the inevitable bubble burst, they used their massive cash reserves to swoop in and purchase valuable distressed assets at fire sale prices. It was a systematic, calculated wealth transfer from the poor and uninformed to the rich and privileged, enabled entirely by deliberately misleading financial reporting. Imagine discovering, while earning a pittance building barns in rural Massachusetts, that the entire financial system, the system built to supposedly create opportunity, was fundamentally rigged, and that the rigging mechanism was hidden in plain sight, disguised as neutral news. That is exactly what Charles Dow figured out. But understanding the scope of the problem and actually solving it were two vastly different challenges. Dow was a nobody, a working-class carpenter with no capital, no influential connections, and absolutely zero credibility in established financial circles. The idea that he could successfully challenge powerful newspaper barons and ruthless Wall Street moguls was openly laughable. They controlled information because they controlled the immense money required to gather and distribute it. Yet, Dow possessed an advantage they lacked. He was not invested in or compromised by the existing corrupt system. He had no wealthy friends to protect, no profitable relationships to maintain. He could afford to tell the unvarnished truth precisely because he had nothing left to lose. Well, except everything. The essential first step was escaping the grueling manual labor. In late 1872, Dow managed to convince the editor of the Springfield Republican to hire him as a part-time reporter covering local business news. His salary was pathetic, a miserable $3 a week, but it granted him access to information networks and, critically, taught him the cynical mechanics of how newspapers actually operated. What he learned was profoundly disturbing. Newspapers were not neutral sources of facts. They were deeply compromised businesses with overwhelming financial interests and political agendas. Publishers routinely suppressed stories that might threaten their lucrative advertisers or their powerful investment partners. Reporters were often paid discreetly to write glowing, favorable coverage of specific, favored companies. Financial journalism, as it existed, was essentially a form of legalized fraud. Dow was not naive about business ethics, but he was genuinely appalled by the complete abandonment of basic journalistic principles. Readers were relying on these publications to provide accurate information for making life-changing financial decisions, and they were being systematically, brazenly deceived. During his first year at the Republican, Dow wrote over 200 articles covering local businesses, banks, and general economic conditions. He quickly developed a reputation for unusual, meticulous thoroughness, actually visiting factories, personally interviewing workers, and examining financial records instead of just mindlessly reprinting corporate press releases. His stories were longer and more detailed than typical business coverage, but they were also unassailably accurate. His real turning point wasn't a local fraud, but a journey to the Wild West. In 1879, Dow joined a group of tycoons and geologists on a 4-day train ride to Leadville, Colorado, to cover the silver mining boom. It was here, amidst the saloons and gambling halls, that he wrote his famous Leadville letters. He observed not just the mines, but the psychology of the financiers, learning exactly how insiders manipulated information. This trip gave him the blueprint of how the smart money actually operated. His shocking exposé revealed that the proclaimed record profits were purely accounting fiction, and the expansion plans were nothing more than desperate attempts to raise cash before inevitable bankruptcy. 3 months later, the company collapsed exactly as Dow had predicted. This was not merely good reporting. It was a radical, new kind of financial journalism based on rigorous, physical verification rather than uncritical speculation. Dow had proven that accurate, verified information was the most potent defense ordinary investors had against sophisticated fraud. The question remained whether anyone with real power would pay attention. Word of Dow's meticulous disruptive investigation eventually reached Boston financial circles, where a small struggling newsletter called The Customer's Afternoon Letter was attempting, and largely failing, to compete with established publications. Its editor, Edward Jones, had heard the stories about the young reporter who actually fact-checked company claims instead of printing them blindly. In March 1875, Jones offered Dow a position in Boston for $12 a week, a substantial 50% pay increase, but more critically, a golden opportunity to cover legitimate financial markets instead of parochial local business news. Dow accepted instantly, not primarily for the money, but because he sensed this was his chance to test whether truly honest, independent financial journalism could survive in such a systemically corrupt industry. He packed his few threadbare belongings, said a final goodbye to his carpentry tools, and boarded the train for Boston. He was 24 years old, possessed $43 in his pocket, and was about to discover exactly how violently dangerous it could be to commit to telling the truth about money. What Dow did not yet know was that Edward Jones harbored his own set of revolutionary ideas about financial information, and together, they would build something that would directly threaten the most powerful financial institutions in America. But Boston was a different beast entirely. Here, Dow wasn't just chasing local fraudsters. He was stepping into the dens of giants, men who owned empires and wouldn't hesitate to crush anyone daring enough to shine a light on their secrets. Boston in 1875 was a simmering financial powder keg. The city's entrenched bankers controlled massive textile mills, the vast, spreading railroad companies, and shipping fortunes that stretched from Maine all the way to California. These men were not just conventionally rich. They were genuine economic emperors, capable of crashing entire industries with a single ruthless decision. And they were about to encounter their most dangerous enemy, a quiet farm boy who stubbornly believed that financial information should be a freely accessible public good. Edward Jones ran the customer's afternoon letter from a cramped, tiny office located precariously above a pungent fish market on State Street. The pervasive smell of cod and mackerel constantly drifted through the floorboards, while Jones and his 2 exhausted employees laboriously hand-copied stock prices and bits of company news for a microscopic subscriber base of local merchants. It was hardly an impressive operation. But Jones possessed one crucial asset that the larger establishment publications lacked: total independence. Unlike the major financial newspapers, Jones did not rely on large Wall Street advertising accounts or the wealthy Boston investors for his publication's survival. His newsletter served middle-class business owners who simply required reliable, factual information to make basic, everyday investment decisions. This financial independence gave him the rare freedom to print uncomfortable truths that other publications would not dare touch. When Dow arrived at the office that first morning, he found Jones frantically scribbling notes while attempting to decipher a stack of confusing telegrams arriving from New York. The stock market was experiencing unusual, terrifying volatility, and no one seemed to understand why railroad stocks were swinging wildly from hour to hour. "Every other paper is printing the same worthless speculation," Jones exclaimed, waving a stack of competing publications. "They're just guessing, but they present it as absolute fact. Our subscribers deserve better than guesses." Dow studied the telegrams closely and noticed something crucial that others had missed. The sharp price movements were not random. They followed specific, recurring patterns directly related to railroad construction announcements. When companies revealed new track expansions, their stocks would initially spike, only to crash violently within days, as savvy investors realized the ambitious projects were inevitably underfunded and threatened new crippling competition. Here's the fascinating point. Dow was identifying what finance professionals today call the announcement effect: how markets react predictably and often irrationally to certain categories of news, entirely irrespective of the underlying business fundamentals. This concept seems obvious now, but in 1875, it was revolutionary thought. What if we tracked these patterns systematically? Dow suggested. Instead of merely reporting individual stock movements, we could analyze the underlying psychological trends that simultaneously drive entire sectors of stocks. Jones was intrigued, but remained deeply skeptical. Their small subscribers wanted immediate, specific investment advice, not abstract pattern analysis. But Dow successfully convinced him to try an experiment. They would spend 1 full month tracking every major corporate announcement and the subsequent price movements, searching for those predictable recurring relationships. The resulting data was stunning. Dow discovered that railroad stocks moved in coordinated, massive waves that often had little to do with individual company performance. When one major railroad announced expansion, competing railroad stocks would initially rise in anticipation, only to fall hard when investors calculated that the increased bloody competition would ultimately hurt everyone's profits. Think about the implication. Stock prices were not reflecting rational, detailed business analysis. They were driven almost entirely by psychological momentum and mass human emotion that created profoundly predictable cycles. Dow was, in effect, inventing behavioral finance 50 years before academic scholars bothered to give it a name, but understanding market psychology and actually profiting from it were vastly different challenges. Dow and Jones were journalists, not traders. Their fundamental goal was not to make money from these insights themselves, but to empower their subscribers to make wiser, more informed investment decisions. This critical ethical distinction would become fiercely crucial later. By the winter of 1875, the customer's afternoon letter had gained a rapidly growing reputation for unusually accurate and insightful market analysis. Subscription numbers soared from 200 to over 800, and larger established newspapers began shamefully copying their insights without offering any credit. Inevitably, success brought intense new problems. Wealthy Boston investors began exerting intense pressure on Jones to suppress certain sensitive stories that threatened their financial interests. A prominent, powerful banker offered to triple their subscription revenue if they would simply agree to avoid any negative coverage of his railroad bond holdings. When Jones flatly refused, the banker coolly suggested that their office lease might be unexpectedly terminated. This was not subtle intimidation. This was economic warfare. The entrenched financial establishment understood perfectly that accurate, independent information was their existential enemy. If ordinary investors could suddenly make decisions based on reliable, verifiable data, the insider advantages that created their vast, inherited fortunes would instantly evaporate. Dow watched these pressure campaigns with cold, growing anger. He realized that truly independent financial journalism was fundamentally impossible without absolute financial independence, as long as they remained dependent on subscribers, advertisers, or even their landlord. They could be controlled and corrupted by the very people who profited most from information inequality. The solution emerged from an unexpected source. Charles Bergstresser, a sharp, young reporter from Philadelphia, who had been closely following their work and believed they were fundamentally solving the wrong problem. Instead of trying to tediously reform the existing financial journalism, they should boldly create an entirely new category of information service. Before the printing presses roared, the empire began with something far more fragile. They started with flimsies, handwritten news bulletins scribbled on thin sheets of tissue paper and carbon, rushed by messenger boys to Wall Street brokerages throughout the day. This evolved into the customer's afternoon letter in 1883, a 2-page summary that became the direct ancestor of the Wall Street Journal. It was primitive, physically exhausting work, but it was the grandfather of the modern newsfeed. Newspapers serve too many masters, Bergstresser argued during a secret meeting in February 1876. Subscribers, advertisers, political parties, business interests. What if we served only one master, the truth? His proposal was radical in the extreme. Create a news service that sold nothing but objective, verified factual information, devoid of all opinion or bias. No editorials, no investment advice, no political commentary, just painstakingly verified facts that subscribers could use to derive their own conclusions and make their own decisions. Revenue would be generated solely from information accuracy, not from pleasing powerful, interested parties. Jones was deeply skeptical. People want analysis, not just raw data. They want us to tell them what to buy and sell. But Dow instantly grasped the sheer genius of Bergstresser's idea. The central problem with existing financial journalism wasn't just bias. It was the dangerous, deliberate mixing of objective facts with subjective, self-serving opinions. If they could cleanly separate objective, verified information from subjective, self-interested interpretation, they could construct an entity that no amount of money or pressure could ever corrupt. The three men spent intense weeks debating the practical implementation details. How could they possibly gather information faster and more accurately than entrenched competitors? How would they verify crucial facts without relying on parties with vested interests? And how would they price their unique service high enough to generate the financial independence necessary for survival? The critical breakthrough came when Dow suggested focusing intensely on speed rather than in-depth analysis. Instead of writing thoughtful, retrospective articles about market trends, they would provide real-time, instantaneous updates on prices, trading volumes, and crucial corporate announcements. Subscribers would receive this intelligence within mere minutes or hours of the events occurring, giving them a massive, insurmountable advantage over rival investors who relied on slow daily newspapers. This required completely rethinking how financial news was gathered and distributed. Instead of one reporter covering multiple stories, they would require an army of trusted correspondents stationed in every major financial center, all connected by independent telegraph networks capable of instantaneous transmission. The required investment was staggering, at least $2,000 for specialized telegraph equipment, rented office space, and correspondence salaries. None of them possessed anywhere near that amount of money. They were asking strangers to fund a radical business model that had never been tested, competing directly against established publications with decades of experience and powerful political connections. But Bergstresser had already identified a niche group of potential investors who were deeply frustrated with the existing, slow financial media. These were successful businessmen who had personally lost money because newspapers provided late or inaccurate information. They understood the irreplaceable value of reliable, immediate data and were willing to pay premium prices for it. In March 1876, the three partners signed the definitive agreements creating Dow Jones and Company, a name that would ultimately become synonymous with the entire American capitalist project. Their audacious mission statement was simple: to provide accurate financial information without bias or agenda. To strike at the heart of the establishment, they needed to be where the pulse was loudest. In 1882, Dow and Jones rented a small, noisy office at 15 Wall Street in New York City, placing themselves directly in the throbbing center of the financial district. The location was a strategic masterstroke. They were now physically close enough to the stock exchange floor as to hear the whispers before they became news, yet fiercely independent enough to report the uncomfortable truths those whispers tried to hide. But they didn't fight this war with expensive technology. While the big banks relied on slow, bureaucratic telegraph operators, Dow and Jones fought a war of pure speed using something much simpler: flimsies. These were handwritten news bulletins scribbled on thin sheets of tissue paper and carbon, created in the heat of the moment. This was the battle of the flimsies. To distribute them, Dow and Jones deployed a fleet of street-smart messenger boys who didn't just walk, they sprinted. They became a blur of motion through the mud and chaos of lower Manhattan, weaving between horse-drawn carriages with their hands stained black by carbon paper. Each flimsy was a weapon, a handwritten bullet of raw data delivered directly to a broker's desk, minutes before the official wires could even process the information. It was a race of sweat against electricity, and for the first time in history, the truth was winning by a heartbeat. What they failed to fully anticipate, however, was just how violently the entrenched financial establishment would react once they realized these flimsies were dismantling their monopoly on power. Within weeks of opening their doors, they discovered that powerful enemies were already collaborating to destroy them before they could even establish a foothold. The war for information independence, the true war for the soul of American finance, was about to begin. New York was not Boston. By moving to 15 Wall Street, Dow wasn't just opening an office. He was stepping directly into a war zone. He was no longer chasing local frauds. He was challenging the titans of an era, men who owned empires and would stop at nothing to protect the secrets that made them kings. Wall Street in 1882 was sheer, deafening chaos wrapped in layers of expensive wool suits. Every morning at 9:30 a.m., when the exchange officially opened, the narrow cobblestone streets below filled instantly with dozens of frantic runners carrying handwritten messages between competing brokerage houses. Information moved at the agonizing speed of human legs, and fortunes were made or brutally lost in the critical minutes it took news to travel a mere 3 city blocks. Charles Dow stood at his second-story window, observing this medieval information system with the detached, analytical eyes of a man who understood one absolute truth: whoever could move the data faster than anyone else would inevitably control everything. The rudimentary telegraph lines connecting major cities were tightly monopolized by Western Union, which charged outrageous rates and routinely delayed or suppressed critical messages that threatened their own business partners' interests. Dow Jones and Company had been operating for 6 tumultuous years, but they were still fighting tooth and nail for survival. Their subscriber base had expanded to 200, but revenue barely managed to cover core expenses. The powerful major newspapers were shamelessly copying their innovative reporting style while using their superior resources to relentlessly undercut prices. Worse, Dow Jones was facing coordinated, relentless attacks from financial interests who perceived accurate, timely reporting as a direct, deadly threat to their profitable margins. The problem was beyond mere competition. It was systemic sabotage. Telegraph operators would mysteriously lose or delay their most critical messages. Office landlords would suddenly and arbitrarily demand massive rent increases. Potential subscribers would receive anonymous, chilling warnings about the unreliability of independent news services. This was not simply business. It was financial war waged in the shadows. But Dow, ever the careful observer, had been studying the street runners, and he noticed a pattern that would change everything. The most successful messenger services were not those with the fastest, strongest runners. They were the services that utilized the most efficient networks. Instead of sending a runner directly between two distant destinations, they created central hub systems where information could be rapidly collected, sorted, and redistributed to multiple locations simultaneously. What if they applied this precise principle to financial information? Instead of competing directly against Western Union's overwhelming telegraph monopoly, they could create their own rapid, hyper-efficient distribution network using a small army of dedicated correspondents who gathered information locally and transmitted it through independent, rapid channels. The practical breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Gustav Galfus, a sharp young immigrant who worked as a low-level telegraph operator at the stock exchange, manually recording every price change throughout the trading day. He approached Dow with a truly revolutionary idea. Instead of waiting for the official consolidated price reports released at the market's close, they could gather continuous, real-time updates throughout the entire trading session. Every time a stock price changes, I scribble it down on a small slip of paper, Galus explained. By closing time, I have hundreds of these slips, but nobody sees them until the next morning's slow newspapers. What if we could get this information to subscribers within minutes of the price changes actually happening? Consider the seismic implication of this proposal. In 1882, the world of investment was based on archaic latency. Decisions were founded on the immutable closing prices of the previous day. Investors, regardless of their position or wealth, operated in a profound darkness, having no genuine insight into the current trading day's performance until after the closing bell and the subsequent printing of official reports. Real-time price information was not merely a convenience. It represented an epochal competitive advantage, capable of restructuring the financial power hierarchy instantly. But achieving this required overcoming technical and infrastructural challenges that, at the time, seemed utterly insurmountable. Dow's counter-solution was a masterful exercise in decentralized simplicity. Instead of attempting to construct a monolithic, centralized information utility, a system prone to single-point failure and easily targeted by regulators, they opted to build multiple overlapping intelligence networks designed to verify and cross-reference one another's accuracy. They began recruiting a grassroots army, mid-level telegraph operators hungry for supplemental income, stock clerks weary of the established oligarchy, and nimble exchange runners. These sources would provide information in exchange for small regular stipends. Crucially, every incoming slip of information was meticulously cross-checked against independent parallel reports to prevent errors, deliberate manipulation, or the insertion of fabricated data. What Dow and Jones were pioneering was nothing less than the concept we now recognize as crowdsourcing, 50 years before the technological infrastructure, or even the terminology for distributed intelligence existed. By aggregating validated information from scores of independent, decentralized sources, they achieved a statistical reliability that far exceeded the accuracy or speed of any single ponderous official channel. The technical implementation of this vision stretched 1880s technology to its absolute limit. They installed specialized pneumatic tubes connecting their central office directly to the back rooms of major brokerage houses, allowing handwritten documents and price updates to be transmitted instantly, bypassing the need for human runners. For basic, high-speed communication outside the wire grid, they established visual signal systems. Colored flags, visible from their rooftop observation points, allowed for the rapid conveyance of essential market sentiment or binary yes or no answers without incurring telegraphic costs. Most critically, they partnered with local machinists to create and deploy the first mechanical stock ticker service independent of Western Union's control. These custom-built devices could receive Dow's proprietary telegraph signals and automatically print continuous, verified stock prices onto paper strips. This was more than mere commercial novelty. It was a fundamental, transformative shift in the operating physics of financial markets. For the first time in history, accurate, timely price information was democratically available to anyone willing to pay a subscription fee, regardless of their social rank, personal connections, or insider status. As Dow's tickers began their steady click, click, click in offices across the city, the silent monopoly of the elite was being dismantled, one paper strip at a time. But in the wood-paneled boardrooms of the Titans, this was not seen as progress. It was seen as an act of high treason against the established order. The establishment realized they could no longer ignore this pencil pusher from the countryside. They needed to crush him, and they were preparing to use the full weight of their capital to do it. The response from the Wall Street establishment to Dow's democratic information grid was swift, predictable, and brutal. The powerful major brokerage houses exerted immense pressure on the official stock exchange leadership to immediately ban unauthorized price reporting. Western Union, recognizing the existential threat to its information monopoly, threatened to cut off essential telegraph services to any firm or publication that dared compete with them. Meanwhile, prominent newspapers launched coordinated editorial campaigns, hysterically claiming that rapid price distribution would simply cause market instability and catastrophic speculation. But Dow had anticipated this coordinated resistance. He had spent months cultivating relationships with key exchange officials, subtly shifting the conversation away from competition and toward mutual benefit. He argued persuasively that price transparency was the indispensable foundation for financial stability, claiming it would increase rational investor confidence and, ultimately, attract exponentially more capital to American markets. The turning point arrived dramatically during the crippling railroad strike of 1885. Labor disputes had paralyzed transportation networks nationwide, injecting massive, destabilizing uncertainty into the valuation of railroad companies, the core assets of the financial system. Traditional newspapers, relying on slow reports and panicky speculation, were publishing conflicting, often fictional accounts, causing wild, uncontrolled price swings that threatened to collapse the market. Dow's proprietary network proved its invaluable worth. They provided minute-by-minute updates based on verified, triangulated information gathered directly from railroad executives, key union leaders, and government officials overseeing the negotiations. While competing publications fueled panic with unconfirmed rumors, Dow's subscribers possessed accurate, reliable data, empowering them to make rational, calculated investment decisions amidst the chaos. When the strike was finally resolved and markets began to stabilize, financial leaders recognized a crucial truth. Reliable, rapid information networks had demonstrably reduced volatility rather than increasing it. Shortly thereafter, the Stock Exchange Board formally voted to cooperate with independent news services that could meet Dow's established standards for accuracy. This was not merely a business victory for Dow Jones. It was profound validation of Dow's core philosophical belief that information transparency strengthened, rather than weakened, capitalist markets. Yet, prosperity brought new internal challenges that would test the endurance of their principles against overwhelming commercial pressures. By 1887, Dow Jones Company was successfully processing well over 1,000 price updates every single day, serving a rapidly expanding subscriber base of nearly 3,000 clients. Annual revenue had swelled to $40,000, a sum long enough to ensure genuine independence from external financial coercion. But such growth inevitably attracted aggressive competitors with far deeper pockets and significantly fewer ethical constraints. Thomas Edison had already perfected an improved ticker technology that transmitted information faster and more reliably than Dow's mechanical custom-built systems. Western Union, desperate to regain dominance, was offering free subsidized ticker services to major subscribers, offsetting the loss with the immense profits from their telegraph monopoly. Meanwhile, established newspaper titans, backed by wealthy investors, were launching their own real-time price services. Dow realized that technical superiority alone was an insufficient defense. They needed something fundamentally unpurchasable, a reputation for absolute, unquestionable reliability. The solution required Dow to shift his focus beyond mere factual reporting toward the rigorous analysis of the deeper, invisible mathematical patterns that genuinely drove price movements. But first, he had to survive a coordinated, ruthless attack aimed at destroying every single thing they had painstakingly built. Every single ticker machine in their meticulously constructed network had gone instantly silent. Their carefully built information empire was suddenly, catastrophically, blind and mute. This was not an unfortunate mechanical failure. It was a deliberate, economic maneuver. Within hours, Dow discovered the full scale of the operation. 3 major, well-funded competitors had simultaneously launched improved ticker services at prices 40% below Dow Jones and Company's established rates. The financial establishment had finally grasped the magnitude of the threat that independent, verifiable information posed to their historical control systems. They leveraged their superior capital resources to flood the market with subsidized alternatives, while simultaneously attempting to annihilate Dow's credibility through a coordinated disinformation campaign. But they had profoundly underestimated their enemy. Dow had been secretly developing what he privately termed market barometers, mathematical systems designed not for tracking the erratic movements of individual stocks, but for quantifying and tracking overall, aggregated market trends. He noticed that groups of related stocks moved together in measurable, predictable patterns, creating discernible waves of activity that could be tracked, modeled, and even anticipated. The first genuine test of his hidden weapon came during the immediate panic selling that followed Western Union's sabotage attempt. Without access to the vital telegraph networks, most subscribers logically assumed that Dow Jones Company was finished. Dow watched this chaos unfold with the serene calm of someone who understood the underlying mechanism. The dramatic price movements were not reflecting genuine business fundamentals. They were purely emotional reactions to engineered information uncertainty. Utilizing emergency messenger networks and backup communication systems that he had established years prior, Dow began distributing special, confidential reports. These reports explained the stable mathematical patterns underlying the apparent chaos. His analysis systematically proved that the selling panic was artificially created and would inevitably reverse once accurate information flow resumed. Within 3 agonizing days, his predictions proved precisely correct. Prices snapped back to previous rational levels. Subscribers who had adhered strictly to Dow's mathematical analysis avoided significant losses, while those who succumbed to the emotional panic were financially devastated. This was far beyond successful market reporting. It was a visceral demonstration that mathematical understanding of market behavior was exponentially more valuable than raw information speed. Dow had proven he could anticipate market reversals using systematic analysis that his technologically superior competitors could not even begin to replicate. The victory over Western Union's sabotage was a turning point, but for Charles Dow, it was also an exhausting realization. He had proven that mathematical truth could defeat engineered panic, yet he remained a David fighting a legion of Goliaths. Word of his almost prescient analytical capabilities spread like wildfire through the most exclusive Wall Street circles. Instead of trying to destroy Dow's business with blunt force, the major financial institutions shifted their tactics. They decided to try and buy the man they could not break. As 1885 drew to a close, Dow received a series of staggering offers. The largest firms on Wall Street, institutions connected to names like Morgan and Rockefeller, approached him privately. They offered Dow enormous, non-negotiable annual retainers to become their exclusive analytical consultant. The promise was simple. Within 5 years, Dow would be one of the wealthiest men in America. The price, however, was his soul. He had to cease publishing his analytical methods in the public sphere and provide his unique market insights exclusively to the elite. Dow understood exactly what these propositions represented. Wall Street was attempting to buy back the information monopoly he had just shattered. His refusal was immediate and absolute. He grasped the essential truth. His insights retained their profound value only if they remained rigorously independent of the financial interests they were analyzing. To accept their money would be to irrevocably compromise the objectivity that made his work a beacon of truth. Instead, Dow made a counterproposal that shocked the establishment. He announced he would publish his comprehensive market analysis openly for any subscriber willing to pay the standard rates. This decision was rooted in his unwavering belief that true market democracy required fundamental information democracy. If the tools for understanding market behavior were hoarded by the wealthy, they would simply become new mechanisms for exploitation. Dow didn't wait for a grand announcement to launch his next revolution. He started small. On July 3, 1884, in a 2-page summary called the Customer's Afternoon Letter, Dow published his first average. It wasn't the industrial average we know today. It was a list of 11 stocks, 9 railroads, and 2 non-rails. He simply added up their prices and divided by 11. For the first time in history, people didn't just see individual stock prices. They saw the market itself moving as a single breathing entity. This was the birth of the modern stock index. When his industrial average rose while his railroad average fell, Dow identified what he called a significant internal shift in capital. He was engineering superior tools for understanding market behavior, but in doing so, he inadvertently created the foundational system for how modern markets measure their own performance. While his enemies focused on destroying his delivery business, Dow was building an analytical framework that would render raw data delivery obsolete. Dow understood exactly what these propositions represented. Wall Street was attempting to buy back the information monopoly he had shattered. His refusal was immediate, absolute, and delivered without the slightest hesitation. But declining the gold of Morgan and Rockefeller meant declaring open warfare against the most powerful financial interests in America. By early 1894, the established elite realized they could not buy Charles Dow, so they decided to bury him. The final decisive assault on Dow's vision began. They leveraged every ounce of institutional power, legal threats, advertising boycotts, and coordinated market manipulation to crush the Wall Street Journal. They wanted to restore the era of aristocratic control, where the public was kept in the dark and the elite feasted on the ignorance of the masses. Dow watched these pressure campaigns with cold, growing anger. He realized that a newspaper alone was no longer enough. To win this war, he didn't just need to report the facts. He needed to build a weapon that was mathematically undeniable, a tool so powerful that no amount of money or influence could corrupt its truth. As the 19th century drew to a close, the era of the Titan of information was ending. Dow was no longer just a reporter. He was about to become an architect. He was preparing to unveil a mathematical innovation that would move the center of power from the private ledgers of the elite to the public ink of the people. The stage was set. The weapon was forged. Dow was preparing to move the center of power from the private ledgers of the elite to the public ink of the people. The world was about to wake up to a new language of wealth. May 26, 1896. On this quiet Tuesday morning, Charles Dow published 12 unassuming numbers in the Wall Street Journal that would change the world forever, marking the analytical genesis of global capitalism. Tucked into a small box on page 2, the first official calculation of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, 40.94 point, was more than a mere figure. It was the formal refinement of Dow's life's work into a singular, devastatingly powerful weapon. By selecting these 12 smokestack companies, Dow was not just picking stocks. He was identifying the new backbone of a rising superpower. From American Sugar to General Electric, these firms represented the raw industrial muscle of a nation, transforming itself from a resource extraction economy into a global manufacturing titan. In that moment, Dow had successfully achieved the impossible. He had turned the stock market from a chaotic, smoke-filled gambling den into a scientific phenomenon. Dow's true genius, however, was his refusal to keep these findings locked in a vault for the elite. Instead, he published them daily for the world to see, effectively handing the public a map to navigate the storm. For the first time, an ordinary citizen could look past the erratic waves of daily trade and perceive the deep underlying tide of the entire economy. He had invented a universal language, a mathematical DNA that would eventually allow every pension fund and every small investor to measure wealth, assess risk, and evaluate economic health with the same precision as the giants of Wall Street. This was the birth of a new era. The fog of disorganized data was lifting, replaced by an elegant, democratic yardstick. Charles Dow had not just created an index, he had forged a machine of transparency that would forever dismantle the information monopoly of the Gilded Age. Yet, Dow himself had no idea of the historic power he had unleashed. He simply thought he was publishing a convenient, useful tool for tracking overall market conditions. The very concept of a stock market index, a single representative metric, did not even exist yet. Dow was solving a profoundly practical problem. In 1896, financial newspapers published endless, dense tables of individual stock prices that were meaningless to most readers. A typical investor, lacking specialized knowledge and hours for complex calculations, could not determine whether the market was rising, falling, or merely churning without substantial effort. The entire financial landscape was shrouded in a fog of disorganized data. Dow realized that averaging a selected representative group of stock prices could create a single elegant number that captured overall market movement. These weren't just random picks. They were the titans of the Gilded Age, representing the raw muscle of the American economy. The list included powerhouses like American Sugar, American Tobacco, U.S. Rubber, and the behemoth U.S. Leather. Interestingly, only one name from that original dozen would survive on the index for over a century: General Electric. While companies like distilling and cattle feeding would fade into obscurity or liquidation, this collection was the first true mirror held up to American industry. The mathematical concept was elegantly simple. Take the current closing stock prices of major companies, add them together, and divide the sum by the number of companies. The result was an average that would rise when the underlying stocks were gaining value and fall when most were declining. Anyone who could handle basic arithmetic could immediately understand the market's directional trend, but the real genius lay in selecting which companies to include. This required extraordinary economic and analytical judgment. Dow could not simply average all existing stocks. Many were too small, too specialized, or too volatile to represent broader industrial conditions. He required companies that were large enough, stable enough, and representative enough to serve as proxies for American industrial prosperity. These selections revealed Dow's forward-thinking understanding. American economic power was rapidly shifting away from railroads and agriculture toward manufacturing and industrial production. His index captured companies that processed raw materials into finished, value-added products, reflecting the transformation of America from a resource extraction economy to a global manufacturing powerhouse. The index's genius was not static, it was dynamic. It lay not just in the initial selection, but in creating a mathematical framework governed by the evolving concept of the divisor that could change. When companies merged, executed stock splits, or dropped out of major industrial activity, Dow implemented precise adjustments to his calculations to maintain historical and mathematical continuity. The index would track economic reality faithfully, even as the individual components rose and fell. It was a living analytical model. But a model is only an academic exercise until it is tested in the fires of a real-world crisis. For the Dow Jones Industrial Average, that crucible arrived just months after its birth. At the heart of this system lay a logic so simple yet so profound that it remains the ultimate lie detector of modern capitalism: the rule of confirmation. These numbers were far more than a daily report. They were the architectural foundation of an entirely new financial philosophy. While Dow himself never penned a formal volume, his rigorous editorials during the 1896 crisis provided the raw intelligence for what would become his greatest legacy. This body of work was later refined and immortalized by his successors, beginning with S. A. Nelson's seminal The ABC of Stock Speculation, and later perfected by William Peter Hamilton and Robert Rhea. Together, they distilled Dow's observations into a definitive system of market laws, identifying the critical cycles of accumulation, public participation, and distribution, and enshrining the cardinal rule that the industrial and transportation averages must confirm one another to validate a true economic trend. The first practical test came during the financial panic of 1896, when political uncertainty over monetary policy triggered massive, indiscriminate selling pressure. Traditional financial reporting descended into chaos as hundreds of individual stocks moved wildly in different directions simultaneously. But Dow's industrial average provided clear mathematical proof that overall market conditions were deteriorating steadily, cutting through the confusion with objective precision. On July 8, 1896, the Dow Jones Industrial Average hit its panic low of 28.48, a brutal decline of more than 30% from its May debut. This was not merely a data point. It was mathematical evidence that the structural foundation of American industrial prosperity was under dire threat. Investors who understood Dow's analytical framework could see the economic crisis developing before it became obvious through traditional, subjective indicators. This was utterly revolutionary. For the first time in financial history, market conditions could be measured with scientific precision rather than subjective intuition. Arguments about whether the markets were strong or weak were no longer matters of opinion, they were settled by mathematics. Dow had successfully created an objective standard for economic performance, but the ultimate power of this standard lay in its internal synergy. Dow understood that in the court of economic truth, one witness was not enough. He required a system of cross-verification to prove that a trend was not a mere anomaly, but a systemic shift. This realization led to his most enduring analytical doctrine, the tracking of the new industrial average alongside the established railroad average. The mathematical relationship between these two distinct indices revealed economic patterns that were entirely invisible when analyzing either sector alone. When both averages rose together, it indicated broad, robust economic expansion, benefiting all major industries. When they moved in opposite directions, it warned of structural economic changes that were helping some sectors while hurting others. But Dow had one golden rule that traders ignore at their peril: the rule of confirmation. Dow believed you couldn't just look at the industrial average. You had to look at the transportation average, originally the rails. The logic was undeniable. If industries are making goods, industrials rise, they must ship them, transports rise. If industrials soar but transports flatline, the goods are piling up in warehouses and a crash is coming. They must confirm each other like two witnesses to a crime, and when both declined simultaneously, it clearly signaled an economic contraction that would affect the entire business system. Think of it as the make and move rule. If the industrials average, the makers, hits a new high, but the transports average, the movers, does not, it means factories are churning out goods that aren't being shipped. That pile-up is the first whisper of a recession. Even today, traders watch FedEx and Uber alongside Apple to see if the economy is truly moving. And there was one final ingredient to verify the truth: volume. Dow and his successors insisted that volume must confirm the trend. In a true bull market, volume should increase when prices rise and decrease when prices dip. If prices are rising on thin volume, Dow warned it was a trap, a hollow move driven by lack of sellers, not the presence of buyers. It remains one of the most reliable lie detectors in finance today. Dow was, in essence, creating what modern economists call leading indicators, mathematical tools that predict nascent economic trends months before they become obvious through lagging measures like employment, factory production, or government statistics. His indices were revealing economic reality long before official reports could capture it. The analytical power became indisputable during the economic recovery that tentatively began in late 1896. Dow's industrial average began its ascent in August. While most financial observers remained steeped in pessimism about business conditions, subscribers tracking his mathematical indicators could see economic improvement developing before it manifested in corporate earnings or employment data. When President McKinley's election in November 1896 triggered a massive bull market rally, subscribers to the Journal were not surprised. Dow's indices had been showing improving economic fundamentals for months. The political catalyst simply released buying pressure that mathematical analysis had already detected. These successful real-world applications transformed Dow's daily editorials from mere market commentary into a rigorous school of thought. While Dow himself never wrote a formal book, the patterns he identified during these turbulent months provided the raw intelligence for what his successors would eventually codify into a definitive system of market laws. By the end of 1896, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had soared to 78.26, a near 200% increase from its July low. More importantly, the clear mathematical patterns revealed by Dow's analytical framework had proven their profound predictive and descriptive value under conditions of extreme market stress. Yet, Dow understood that his greatest achievement was not the creation of useful investment tools, but the democratization of analytical capabilities that had previously been the exclusive preserve of financial insiders. Anyone who could read numbers could now track market conditions with the same precision, clarity, and objectivity as the wealthiest Wall Street professionals. The response from the financial establishment was immediate and desperate. Major banks began developing proprietary index systems, attempting to create competing mathematical frameworks that would reduce Dow's influence. Prominent economists, many influenced by institutional funding, published highly technical papers claiming that mathematical market analysis was inherently flawed, reductionist, and misleading. These attacks missed the central point entirely. Dow was not claiming that his indices could predict the future with certainty. He was providing tools for measuring present reality more accurately than subjective interpretation allowed. Whether markets rose or fell was less important than having objective, verifiable methods for determining what was actually happening. The broader implications were staggering. If mathematical tools could measure market conditions objectively, they could also identify precisely when those markets were being manipulated artificially. Dow's indices became mathematical lie detectors that could expose coordinated attempts to distort market reality through insider trading, wash sales, or the spreading of false information. This newfound analytical capability terrified financial institutions that depended heavily on information advantages and market manipulation for their colossal profits. They couldn't compete against mathematical truth. They could only try to discredit or control the person who provided it. But Dow had built something that could not be destroyed by attacking its creator. The mathematical principles underlying his indices were fully reproducible by anyone with basic analytical skills. Even if the Wall Street Journal vanished, other publications could calculate similar averages using the same methodology. He had achieved true information democracy. Analytical tools powerful enough to challenge Wall Street's elite, simple enough for ordinary investors to understand, and transparent enough to resist corruption or manipulation. The financial aristocracy's information monopoly was broken forever. What Dow did not anticipate was how profoundly his mathematical creation would evolve beyond his original intentions, eventually becoming the foundation for financial instruments worth trillions of dollars and economic theories that would reshape global capitalism itself. Dow didn't need a dramatic showdown in an office to challenge the elite. He did it daily in print. Dow publicly listed the names of companies that hesitated to give information about profit and loss. His weapon wasn't a confrontation with J.P. Morgan, but a relentless demand for transparency. He stated that the Wall Street Journal would be a paper of news and not a paper of opinions, effectively declaring war on the era of insider secrets. But Dow was running out of time to fully implement his vision. The immense stress of defying Wall Street's most powerful titans while simultaneously architecting a revolutionary analytical system was rapidly eroding his health. Charles Dow was about to face his final, most daunting challenge, ensuring that his democratic innovations could survive long after their creator was gone. This internal struggle would set the stage for his ultimate confrontation with the king of the establishment, J.P. Morgan. This meeting wasn't truly about market stability. It was entirely about power. Dow's indices had proven that objective mathematical analysis could predict market movements more accurately than the insider information, political connections, and intuitive judgment that traditional financiers relied upon. When ordinary people could make informed investment decisions based on objective, accessible data, the core advantages that created Wall Street fortunes began to disappear. But Morgan had come initially with an offer of cooperation, not immediate threats. He proposed creating a financial information council that would standardize how market data was collected, analyzed, and distributed. This council, he explained, would be funded exclusively by major banks and brokerage houses, thereby ensuring professional oversight of financial analysis that affected public investment decisions. Dow understood immediately what this proposal represented: a sophisticated attempt by Wall Street to regain authoritative control over financial information. They planned to create official institutions that would filter, interpret, and selectively release data to the public. His democratic analytical tools would be neutered by layers of professional review that ultimately served the financial insider's interests. Mathematical truth does not require professional oversight, Dow replied calmly, his voice steady against Morgan's imposing presence. Either stock prices are rising or they're falling. Either market trends are developing or they're not. Numbers don't lie, Mr. Morgan. People do. Morgan did not leave empty-handed. He left with a strategic blueprint to dismantle Dow's credibility. If the man could not be bought, the very concept of independent financial truth had to be systematically destroyed. The confrontation moved from the private boardroom to the public arena as the establishment prepared to unleash the full weight of its media influence. This confrontation transcended mere financial indices. It was a fundamental clash between democratic and aristocratic approaches to information access. Morgan firmly believed that ordinary people lack the capacity to handle accurate financial data without the guidance of their financial superiors. Dow believed that democratic capitalism inherently required democratic access to verifiable information. This was the ultimate gatekeeping strategy, a sophisticated attempt to hide the truth behind a wall of professional credentials. But Clarence Barron, the man Dow chose to guard the flame, saw through the deception immediately. He understood that the only way to defeat engineered complexity was through radical simplicity and relentless public education. Morgan's response revealed exactly how gravely the financial establishment felt threatened by objective market analysis. He explained with barely concealed anger that Dow's indices were encouraging dangerous speculation by people who lacked the experience to properly interpret complex market signals. Here is the fascinating point. Morgan was essentially arguing that accurate information itself was dangerous because it might lead to poor decisions by unsophisticated investors. The solution, in his view, was not better education or clearer analysis, but restricting access to information that might be misused by those without proper financial training. This logic was self-serving nonsense, and both men knew it. Sophisticated investors made terrible decisions constantly. They simply had enough capital to survive their catastrophic mistakes. The real problem was that accurate, independent information directly threatened the profitable advisory relationships between financial professionals and their clients. When clients could analyze markets independently, they no longer needed expensive advice from Wall Street experts. Dow's refusal to cooperate with Morgan's Financial Information Council triggered the most sophisticated and coordinated assault on independent financial journalism in American history. Within weeks, major newspapers aligned with Morgan's interests began publishing editorial campaigns claiming that unregulated financial analysis was contributing to market volatility and threatening overall economic stability. The New York Times ran a series titled "The Dangers of Amateur Market Analysis" that ruthlessly portrayed Dow as a reckless promoter of speculation by unqualified, common investors. But the establishment knew that a media smear campaign was only the first layer of defense. To truly bury Dow's influence, they needed to attack the mathematical soul of his work. They turned to the halls of academia, funding scholars to provide an intellectual veneer for their resistance, claiming that the stock market was nothing more than a random walk, a chaotic void that no man, especially a former carpenter, could ever hope to measure. The most damaging attack, however, came from academic economists, many of whom were quietly supported by major financial interests. They published papers claiming that Dow's entire analytical method was mathematically flawed. These scholars argued, using complex theoretical models, that stock market movements were essentially random, a random walk, and therefore could not be predicted or even measured using historical price patterns or mathematical relationships between market sectors. This was a brilliant strategy. Instead of attacking Dow personally or censoring his publications directly, the financial establishment was undermining the intellectual foundation of mathematical market analysis. If academic experts declared that market prediction was scientifically impossible, then Dow's analytical tools would be successfully dismissed as dangerous pseudoscience. The problem for his attackers was that Dow's methods kept working throughout 1901. His industrial and railroad averages accurately predicted several major market movements that caught Wall Street professionals completely off guard. When objective mathematical analysis consistently and measurably outperformed expert subjective judgment, the academic criticism quickly lost public credibility. Dow's strategic response to these attacks revealed his editorial genius. Instead of defending his specific analytical methods, he focused on educating readers about the critical difference between prediction and measurement. His indices were not fortune-telling devices. They were precision instruments for measuring current market conditions. "A thermometer doesn't predict the weather," Dow explained in a famous editorial, "but it measures temperature accurately enough to help you decide whether to wear a coat. My averages measure market temperature. What you do with that information is your decision." This educational campaign transformed the public's understanding of what mathematical market analysis could and couldn't accomplish. Dow acknowledged the inherent limitations of his tools while relentlessly demonstrating their practical value for making informed investment decisions. He wasn't promising to make people rich. He was giving them better, more objective information for making their own choices. By early 1902, the academic and media attacks had spectacularly backfired. The Wall Street Journal subscription base had grown to over 30,000 readers, making it one of the most influential financial publications in the world. More importantly, dozens of other newspapers had begun calculating their own market averages using Dow's fundamental methodology. The democratization of mathematical market analysis had become unstoppable. Mathematical truth couldn't be uninvented or suppressed once it had been demonstrated publicly and proven its utility. While Dow was winning the war of education, the establishment pivoted to their final, desperate strategy. If they couldn't prove Dow was wrong, they would simply drown his voice in a sea of competing noise. The plan was no longer to silence the truth, but to fragment it until it became unrecognizable. But Morgan and his allies had one final strategy. If they couldn't control objective mathematical market analysis, they would flood the system with competing, incompatible systems designed to confuse and fragment public understanding. Multiple conflicting indices would make objective market measurement impossible, thereby restoring the critical information advantage that came from access to superior, centralized sources. This plan nearly succeeded. By mid-1902, over 20 different market averages were being published by various newspapers and financial services. Each used different companies, different mathematical methods, and incompatible interpretive frameworks. Instead of providing clarity, the proliferation of indices was creating analytical chaos. Dow recognized that the credibility of mathematical market analysis was under severe threat from this planned overcomplication and the competition between incompatible systems. His response would establish the principles that still govern how financial indices are created and maintained today. By 1902, Charles Dow had accidentally created something far more powerful and pervasive than he had ever intended. What began as a simple newsletter for Boston merchants had evolved into the recognized nervous system of American capitalism. Dow identified precisely how retail investors lose money. He broke trends down into 3 psychological phases. First, accumulation, where smart money buys when news is bad. Second, public participation, when the trend is obvious. And finally, distribution, when the headlines are glowing and the public rushes in, unaware that the smart money is selling to them. He taught us that when your taxi driver gives you stock tips, the top is near. The Wall Street Journal reached 50,000 subscribers daily. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was quoted in European financial centers. His analytical framework was being ruthlessly copied by newspapers from Chicago to London. But Dow was dying. The decades of 16-hour workdays, the constant, debilitating stress from financial warfare, and the relentless pressure of maintaining analytical accuracy while fighting Wall Street's most powerful interests had broken his health. At 51, he looked 20 years older, moved with the careful steps of someone whose body was failing, and knew he had months, not years, left to secure his legacy. This ticking clock transformed his final months into a race against time. Dow realized that the greatest threat to his work wasn't just his death, but the potential for his mathematical genius to die with him. To prevent this, he began the grueling task of turning his personal judgment into a public blueprint. The fragile empire he had built faced existential threats that could not be solved with mathematical analysis or journalistic integrity alone. His competitors were infinitely better funded, politically connected, and ruthlessly determined to reclaim control over financial information. Without Dow's personal leadership and analytical genius, his democratic innovations might not survive the inevitable storm. This wasn't just about business succession. It was about preserving revolutionary principles against forces that had been trying to destroy them for over 2 decades. Dow had proven that ordinary people could access the same analytical tools as Wall Street insiders, But maintaining that access required resilient institutional structures that could resist capture by the financial establishment. His first immediate priority was ensuring analytical continuity. The Dow Jones Industrial Average wasn't just a static mathematical calculation. It was a precision instrument that required constant maintenance, expert judgment, and evolution to remain accurate. Companies merged, split stocks, changed their core business models, or simply lost their representative value as economic conditions shifted. Dow had been handling these critical adjustments personally, using judgment developed through decades of analyzing market behavior. But relying on subjective decisions about index composition created a vulnerability. They could easily be influenced by outside pressure or corrupted by financial interests seeking to manipulate the mathematical framework that millions of investors relied upon. The solution was creating systematic, documented rules for index maintenance that could be applied objectively, regardless of who was making the decisions. Dow spent his final months documenting the precise principles he used for selecting companies, adjusting for stock splits, and maintaining mathematical continuity when compositional changes became necessary. Dow was essentially creating the world's first systematic methodology for maintaining financial indices. These principles would become the enduring standard practices adopted by index providers worldwide, ensuring that objective mathematical market measurements could maintain their integrity across decades of profound economic and political change. But protecting analytical methodology was only part of the challenge. The Wall Street Journal itself needed to be insulated from the extreme financial pressures that had destroyed other independent publications. Major newspapers traditionally survived by pleasing advertisers, wealthy subscribers, and political allies. Dow's publication succeeded only by providing accurate, objective information, regardless of who was offended by the truth. This required a radical financial independence that could resist external pressure while maintaining the resources necessary for high-quality, unflinching journalism. Dow restructured the Wall Street Journal as a subscription-based service, generating revenue primarily from readers rather than advertisers. This financial model explicitly prioritized editorial independence over maximum profitability. This business strategy was revolutionary for its time. Most newspapers were little more than marketing vehicles, funded by interests seeking to influence public opinion. By making subscribers, rather than advertisers, the primary revenue source, Dow could maintain absolute editorial objectivity even when reporting news that directly threatened powerful financial interests. But even the most perfect financial model and the most rigorous editorial policies required a guardian. Dow knew that the survival of the journal depended on finding a successor whose spine was as strong as his own. The succession question was even more complex. Dow needed someone who combined deep analytical sophistication with absolute ethical integrity and political independence, qualities rarely found together, especially among people with the financial knowledge necessary to maintain his analytical systems. His choice was Clarence Barron, a respected financial journalist from Boston who had been diligently following Dow's methods for over a decade. Barron understood the mathematical principles underlying the Dow Jones averages and shared Dow's fundamental commitment to democratic access to financial information. Crucially, he had demonstrated the moral courage to resist pressure from wealthy interests who sought to influence financial coverage. But transferring leadership required more than finding a qualified successor. Dow needed to create institutional safeguards that would prevent future leaders from being corrupted by the enormous financial incentives that Wall Street could always offer. The temptation to monetize privileged access to market-moving information, a constant flow of inside data, would be overwhelming. Dow's solution was brilliant in its simplicity and foresight. He established rigid editorial policies that prohibited the Wall Street Journal's staff from trading stocks or accepting payments from financial institutions beyond standard subscription fees. These restrictions were not mere ethical guidelines. They were legal requirements, that could be enforced through contractual obligations. Dow was creating the first systematic conflicts of interest policies for financial journalism. These core principles would eventually be adopted by financial publications worldwide, establishing ethical standards that protected editorial independence from corrupting influences. The final challenge was ensuring that his analytical innovations remained publicly accessible rather than becoming proprietary tools controlled by wealthy interests. Major financial institutions were already developing competing index systems that they could manipulate for their own private benefit. If Dow's democratic framework was replaced by proprietary, opaque alternatives, the information monopoly he had broken would be quickly restored. His response was to publish complete, open documentation of his analytical methods, making it possible for any competent mathematician to replicate his calculations independently. The Dow Jones Industrial Average would not depend on secret formulas or proprietary databases. It would be transparent enough for verification by competing analysts. This transparency strategy had profound long-term implications. By making his methods publicly verifiable, Dow created analytical standards that couldn't be corrupted without immediate detection. Any future attempt to manipulate index calculations would be instantly obvious to competing analysts who understood the underlying mathematics. By November 1902, Dow had completed the institutional framework that would preserve his democratic innovations. The Wall Street Journal operated under editorial policies that prioritized accuracy over profitability. The Dow Jones averages were maintained according to systematic rules that prevented subjective manipulation. Succession plans ensured the continuity of leadership committed to democratic access to financial information. This independence was guarded fiercely, not just by Dow, but by the dynasty that followed. After Dow's death, control passed to Clarence Barron, and subsequently his stepdaughter's family, the Bancrofts. For over a century, they held the line. But in 2007, in a seismic shift for the media landscape, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp acquired Dow Jones for $5 billion. Despite fears of bias, the acquisition marked a new era of digital expansion for the brand Dow, built in a candy store basement. But even the most carefully designed institutions are vulnerable to determined attacks by sufficiently powerful interests. Dow's final months were spent preparing his successors for the ongoing battles they would face from a financial establishment that viewed independent analysis as an existential threat to their power structure. His last editorial, published 3 weeks before his death, was a warning disguised as a celebration. He praised the tremendous progress toward democratic access to financial information, while acknowledging that powerful interests would never stop trying to restore their information monopoly. Mathematical truth is not a political opinion, Dow wrote. Either stock prices are rising or they are falling. Either economic trends are developing or they are not. The numbers cannot be negotiated or influenced through wealth or power. They simply are what they are. When Charles Dow passed away in December 1902, he wasn't a forgotten man. His partner Edward Jones wrote a touching tribute, calling his integrity unsullied and his industry prodigious. He left behind a company that had already changed Wall Street forever, sold just months prior to Clarence Barron. He didn't die in obscurity. He died knowing he had lit a torch that others would carry. Charles Dow died on December 4th, 1902, knowing that he had created something that could survive its creator. But he couldn't have imagined how completely his mathematical innovations would reshape global capitalism, or how his democratic principles would influence financial markets for over a century. Charles Dow was gone, but the fire he lit was now a conflagration, threatening to burn down the old structures of Wall Street. As the winter of 1902 deepened, the financial titans realized that while they had buried the man, his mathematical ghost was more dangerous than ever. To regain control, they would have to wage a new kind of war, one fought not with silence, but with sophisticated subversion. December 1902. Wall Street's most powerful financiers gathered in J.P. Morgan's private library, a room built to project absolute, unassailable authority, to discuss the enduring Charles Dow problem. The farm boy from Connecticut was finally dead, but his mathematical monster lived on. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had become too influential to ignore and too democratic to tolerate. "Gentlemen," Morgan announced to the assembled titans, his voice a low rumble, "we have allowed a dangerous precedent to develop. Mathematical market analysis in the hands of ordinary investors threatens the natural order of financial leadership." The irony was absolute. Charles Dow's death, intended by some powerful rivals as the end of his disruptive influence, had instead immortalized his cause. The man was gone, but the mathematical ghost he unleashed was now institutionalized, proving far more resilient than any single personal leadership could be. The Wall Street Journal did not falter. It continued publishing rigorous, transparent market analysis. The Dow Jones averages marched onward, tracking the cold economic reality with verifiable mathematical precision. Democratic access to crucial financial information was no longer a fringe idea. It was embedding itself into the infrastructure of American commerce. This institutionalization was exactly what the financial establishment had feared most. They were experts at destroying individual careers or corrupting specific publications through financial pressure. But they could not uninvent mathematical truth. Once ordinary investors grasped that stock market movements adhered to measurable, quantifiable patterns, that knowledge became an intellectual weapon that could neither be suppressed nor controlled. But Morgan's formidable allies were not defeated. They shifted their strategy from overt destruction to sophisticated subversion. Instead of attempting to obliterate Dow's innovations, they would capture and neutralize them. The major financial institutions launched a concerted effort to flood the market with competing analysis, developing proprietary market indices using similar mathematical methods but underpinned by different, often intentionally opaque, philosophical approaches. The goal was deliberate: to fragment public understanding and restore professional control over the interpretation of financial reality. The opening salvo in this intellectual war was the creation of the Professional Financial Analysis Institute. This ostensibly prestigious organization claimed to provide scientific oversight and rigor to market measurement systems. It was lavishly funded by major banks and staffed exclusively with Ivy League economists, whose primary task was publishing academic papers that criticized the amateur mathematics underlying popular market indices like Dow's. What is fascinating is that these academic critics did not challenge Dow's mathematical accuracy. They couldn't. The numbers were correct. Instead, they questioned whether ordinary investors possessed the necessary training and intellectual capacity to interpret these analytical tools correctly. The purported solution was not better public education or clearer explanation. It was mandatory professional intermediation, a system that would filter mathematical insights through a select class of qualified experts. This argument was a masterful piece of sophisticated propaganda disguised as objective academic research. The financial establishment was essentially making the case that market democracy was incompatible with accurate information because the average citizen couldn't handle complex data without elite professional guidance. Only wealthy investors who could afford access to expensive expert advisors could safely and effectively utilize mathematical market analysis. The practical implementation of this strategy was brilliant in its subtlety. Major brokerage houses began aggressively marketing professionally managed investment services. These services utilized proprietary analytical systems, advertised as being vastly superior to publicly available indices. In reality, these expensive, opaque systems were often less accurate than Dow's transparent, accessible methods. Yet they charged substantial fees for access to this manufactured complexity. Clarence Barron, now the tenacious leader of the Wall Street Journal, recognized this sophisticated assault on democratic financial analysis immediately. He understood the establishment was using engineered complexity and professional mystification to rebuild the information monopoly that Dow had shattered. Barron's strategic response was to double down on transparency and education. The Wall Street Journal refused to compete with professional investment services. Instead, it focused its efforts on teaching its readers how to analyze markets independently, using the same mathematical tools that anyone could understand and verify. This was a direct existential challenge to the entire financial advisory industry. If ordinary investors could capably perform their own market analysis using publicly available data, the demand for expensive professional guidance would collapse. The democratization of analytical capabilities threatened billions of dollars in annual advisory fees. The counterattack from Wall Street was immediate and vicious. Major newspapers influenced by bank advertising dollars published editorials warning that amateur investors were being dangerously misled by overly simplistic analytical tools. Professional investment advisors launched massive advertising campaigns claiming that successful investing required a level of sophisticated, proprietary expertise that simply couldn't be learned from reading a newspaper. These attacks, however, backfired spectacularly. Every criticism leveled at democratic financial analysis only drew more attention to the very mathematical tools that threatened professional monopolies. Ordinary investors, witnessing the transparency of the Dow Jones methodology, began questioning why they needed to pay expensive advisors when they could access the same analytical capabilities independently. By 1905, the Wall Street Journal circulation had exploded to over 100,000 subscribers, cementing its position as one of the most influential publications in America. More significantly, dozens of competing regional newspapers had begun calculating their own market indices, all using variations of Dow's core methodology. The democratic revolution in financial analysis was becoming an unstoppable, self-perpetuating reality. But as the public grew more empowered, the establishment grew more desperate. Having failed to win the war of minds, they turned to the final sanctuary of the powerful, the law. If they couldn't convince the people to ignore the data, they would attempt to make it legally impossible for them to see it. The financial establishment's final strategic gambit was regulatory capture, creating governmental barriers that would restrict access to the data necessary for independent market analysis. They intensely lobbied government officials to classify certain types of real-time financial information as professionally sensitive, requiring special licensing for its distribution. This attempt at regulatory capture nearly succeeded. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, established in response to various financial scandals, initially proposed rules that would have restricted the distribution of real-time market data exclusively to licensed financial professionals. Ordinary investors would be limited to delayed information, effectively neutering the practical value of mathematical analysis, which relies on immediacy. Imagine the historical implications. The government, under the guise of protecting amateur investors from dangerous speculation, successfully restricting access to current stock prices. The democratic principles Charles Dow established would have been annihilated by regulatory bureaucracy, not direct suppression. But this proposal generated massive public opposition. Investors, now accustomed to democratic access to financial information, rose up. Thousands of ordinary Americans wrote passionate letters to Congress, explaining how transparent mathematical market analysis had helped them make superior investment decisions and, crucially, avoid massive losses caused by often self-serving or misleading professional advice. The regulatory attempt collapsed under the weight of this public testimony when it became undeniable that restricting access to financial data would actively harm the very investors it claimed to protect. The empirical evidence was overwhelming. Professional investment advisors had consistently underperformed publicly available indices, proving that expensive proprietary expertise was often less valuable than transparent mathematical analysis. By 1910, Charles Dow's democratic revolution had achieved permanent victory. Mathematical market analysis was widely accepted as a legitimate, necessary tool for the average investor. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was quoted daily in newspapers across the globe. Professional financial institutions were forced to adapt to a new world where their analytical advantages were limited rather than absolute. But the most profound legacy wasn't technical. It was philosophical. Dow had proven that mathematical truth, when transparently presented and verifiable, was ultimately more powerful than accumulated wealth or political influence. When analytical methods were open, they could not be corrupted by interested parties or distorted through professional mystification. This foundational principle extended far beyond financial markets. Democratic access to accurate information became understood as essential for effective democratic decision-making in any context. Whether citizens were choosing investments, political candidates, or economic policies, they required transparent analytical tools that powerful interests could not manipulate. Charles Dow's mathematical innovations had accidentally become weapons for defending democratic institutions against aristocratic capture. The same principles that protected an ordinary investor from Wall Street manipulation could protect an ordinary citizen from political and economic manipulation by any powerful elite. His true legacy was not the creation of useful investment tools, but the demonstration that democracy and accurate information are inseparable requirements for a just and prosperous society. The battle for information democracy that began in a small candy store basement did not end with Dow's death, nor did it fade with the passing of his rivals. Instead, it scaled alongside the very empire it was designed to measure. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Dow's mathematical ghost would face a world of light-speed algorithms and global pandemics, proving that while the tools of trade had evolved, the fundamental heartbeat of capitalism remained exactly as he had calculated it. March 29, 2020. Global stock markets cratered, falling 37% in 5 weeks as the COVID-19 pandemic effectively shut down the world economy. In one catastrophic day, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 2,997 points, the largest single-point drop in its 124-year history. Yet, here is what is truly remarkable. Charles Dow's simple mathematical framework, conceived by a farm boy with a pencil and paper, seamlessly handled a crisis that involved trillions of dollars in computerized high-frequency trading, artificial intelligence, and financial instruments he couldn't have possibly imagined. The index didn't break. It didn't become irrelevant. It did not require a fundamental redesign. Dow's 1896 innovation adapted perfectly to 21st century market chaos by providing a mathematical anchor point when everything else seemed to be spinning wildly out of control. Yet, to the modern academic, Dow's invention appeared to have a structural flaw. As a price-weighted index, it granted a $100 stock 10 times the influence of a $10 stock, a methodology often criticized in an era of market cap giants like the S&P 500. But this perceived weakness hides a deeper, more profound truth. Dow wasn't just measuring capital, he was measuring the human spirit. While modern math focuses on the cold efficiency of market capitalization, Dow's framework captured the psychological pulse of the nation. He understood that in the eyes of the public, the price of a stock carried a weight that no complex algorithm could replicate. It remained a living benchmark because it mirrored the way people, not just machines, perceive value. Even today, as the Dow survives every crisis, it serves as a reminder that while mathematical models may evolve and fade, the fundamental laws of human fear and greed remain eternal. This wasn't merely about financial measurement. In a world where information moves at the speed of light and markets can be manipulated by algorithms trading millions of shares per second, Dow's transparent mathematical methodology remained the most trusted objective source for understanding the actual state of American wealth. When presidents announced economic policies, when the Federal Reserve adjusted interest rates, when corporate CEOs made billion-dollar strategic decisions, they all referenced numbers that traced directly back to Dow's original analytical framework. The mathematical DNA he created in 1896 had become the nervous system for global capitalism. The modern impact extends far beyond tracking stock prices. Every pension fund, every 401(k) account, every defined contribution retirement plan in America uses investment strategies based on index funds that replicate Dow's foundational mathematical approach. When your grandmother checks her retirement account balance on her smartphone, she is interacting with technology built upon Dow's handwritten, manual calculations. Here is the astonishing scale. The total value of global investments linked to Dow's index system now exceeds $15 trillion. That is more wealth than the GDP of the entire United States when Dow was alive. His simple mathematical innovation has become the cornerstone for how ordinary people build wealth through democratic capitalism. Think about that profound scale. A carpenter from Connecticut who never finished college accidentally created the analytical framework that now controls more wealth than existed in the entire world during his lifetime. The mathematical tools he developed to help middle-class merchants make sound investment decisions have become the backbone of global finance. But Dow's democratic principles have proven even more influential than his mathematical innovations. The revolutionary idea that ordinary citizens deserve access to the same analytical tools as financial professionals has fundamentally restructured how information is distributed throughout the modern economy. Today, anyone with an internet connection can access real-time market data, sophisticated analytical tools, and educational resources that were only available to elite Wall Street insiders during Dow's era. Online brokerages offer commission-free trading, low-cost index fund investing, and automated portfolio management, democratizing wealth-building opportunities globally. This monumental transformation was not an accident. It is the direct consequence of the democratic principles Dow established: transparent methodology, objective measurement, and public access to analytical tools. These principles generated competitive pressure that forced financial institutions to expand access rather than restrict it. The impact permeates economic policy. Modern economic governance relies on mathematical frameworks that evolved directly from Dow's market analysis. When the Federal Reserve makes crucial decisions about interest rates, they rely on indicators that trace back to his methods for measuring broad economic trends through stock market behavior. This wasn't just about vague feelings. It was about mathematical precision. Dow's successors identified the concept of the line, a narrow trading range that indicated accumulation or distribution. They observed that secondary corrections would typically retrace 1/3 to 2/3 of the primary move. These weren't random guesses. They were calculated probabilities derived from the Dow divisor, a figure constantly adjusted to account for stock splits, ensuring the index remained a continuous thread of truth. Central banks worldwide use market-based measures to gauge economic health, investor confidence, and financial stability. The mathematical relationships Dow identified between different market sectors have become standard tools for understanding how economic changes propagate through interconnected financial systems. Consider the implications for global economic governance. Decisions that affect billions of people are made using analytical tools created by a man who fundamentally believed that democratic access to accurate information was essential for just economic systems. Dow's mathematical democracy has become indelibly embedded in international economic policy. The technological evolution has been equally profound. Modern index funds, managing over $20 trillion globally, use computerized systems to replicate the mathematical principles Dow developed manually. Exchange-traded funds, ETFs, allow ordinary investors to buy mathematically optimized, diversified portfolios with a single click. But perhaps the most significant legacy is educational. Millions of people now understand the basic principles of mathematical market analysis because Dow's transparent methodology made genuine financial education possible. Investors can learn how markets work rather than just blindly trusting professional advisors, relying on mysterious expertise. This educational democratization has broken down the barriers between professional and amateur investment analysis. While some sophisticated mathematical tools require advanced training, the basic principles of index investing and market measurement are accessible to anyone willing to learn elementary mathematics. The result is a generation of investors who understand that long-term wealth building doesn't require beating the market. It requires participating in overall economic growth through mathematically diversified, low-cost portfolios. This insight, which emerged directly from Dow's analytical framework, has democratized access to prosperity in ways he never fully anticipated. Yet, significant challenges remain, testing whether Dow's democratic principles can survive modern threats. High-frequency trading algorithms can manipulate markets faster than human oversight can detect. However, Dow's principles are now being tested by machines faster than human thought. On May 6, 2010, the world witnessed the flash crash, where the Dow plunged nearly 1,000 points in minutes, driven by high-frequency trading algorithms executing strategies like quote stuffing and spoofing. While the technology has changed from telegraphs to fiber optics, the market psychology of fear and panic that Dow identified remains exactly the same. Cryptocurrency markets often operate outside traditional regulatory frameworks. These technological developments raise fundamental questions about whether democratic access to financial information can be maintained when the information itself is generated and processed by machines operating beyond human comprehension. But Dow's core insight remains powerfully valid. Mathematical truth is ultimately more powerful than technological sophistication. If analytical methods remain transparent and verifiable, they can resist corruption, regardless of how complex the underlying systems become. The principles he established for maintaining democratic access to accurate information are just as relevant for algorithm-driven markets as they were for handwritten price sheets. The ongoing battle between democratic and aristocratic approaches to financial information continues in new forms. While ordinary investors have unprecedented access to data and tools, they also face unprecedented complexity and information overload that can be expertly exploited by sophisticated institutions. Charles Dow's revolution is incomplete, but its trajectory is unstoppable. Each generation faces the fundamental choice between democratic and aristocratic approaches to organizing economic power. The mathematical tools he created provide the weapons for defending democratic principles, but those weapons must be wielded by people who understand what they are fighting for. As we navigate this landscape of artificial intelligence and lightning-fast trades, we realize that the world Charles Dow built has evolved into something far more than a financial index. It has become the silent, mathematical heartbeat of our modern civilization, a genetic code that continues to define the very nature of truth in an era of digital chaos. December 4th, 2024. Exactly 122 years after Charles Dow's quiet passing in a Brooklyn apartment, the closing bell rings on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. As the echoes fade, the Dow Jones Industrial Average flashes on billions of screens, 44,910 points. This staggering figure would have been incomprehensible to the man who began his career in a candy store basement. Yet it follows the exact mathematical principles he established with a precision that defies time. Tonight, as global markets settle, nearly half the planet will interact with that number. Retirement accounts worth trillions of dollars will adjust their breath based on Dow's calculations, and central banks across 190 nations will look to his analytical framework to anchor global policy. The mathematical DNA Dow forged in the 19th century has effectively become the genetic code for modern capitalism. But what would have astonished Dow most is not the scale of the wealth, but the fact that his handwritten innovation remains the absolute North Star in an era of quantum computing and artificial intelligence. He understood a truth that transcends silicon. While technology evolves at light speed, human nature remains anchored. Fear, greed, and the primal tides of optimism follow discernible patterns that can be measured, whether they are carried by a frantic street runner or a fiber optic cable. The Dow Jones today tracks giants like Apple and Microsoft, companies that were science fiction in 1896. Yet the mathematical synergy between them follows the same predictive tides Dow identified in steam engines and steel. He proved that the most chaotic human phenomena can be decoded through an elegant simplicity. By adding representative prices and dividing by a deflator, he created a lie detector more accurate than the most complex statistical models of the modern age. This elegance allowed his framework to survive the 1929 crash, the fires of World War II, the dot-com bubble, and the 2020 pandemic. None of these storms invalidated his work because he didn't build a machine. He discovered a law of nature. Beyond the numbers, however, lies his deepest legacy, a philosophical revolution. Dow was a working-class farm boy with no capital and no formal education who challenged the most powerful aristocrats in America and won. He didn't win through litigation or force. He won through a mathematical accuracy that simply could not be suppressed. He established the radical principle that in a democracy, the truth must be public property. He believed that the ordinary citizen deserved the same analytical weapons as the billionaire elite, a vision now realized through the smartphones in our pockets and the commission-free trades of the digital age. Yet, as we move deeper into the era of algorithms, Dow's revolution remains incomplete. We face a new kind of information aristocracy, one of filter bubbles, high-frequency manipulation, and engineered confusion. But his career provides the ultimate blueprint for the future. Transparency is the only antidote to corruption. The future of a just society depends on our ability to maintain the principles Dow lived for: public access to data, transparent methodology, and a refusal to allow the truth to be hoarded by a select few. Charles Dow's greatest achievement wasn't a stock index. It was the proof that an ordinary person can understand a complex world if they are given the right tools. As you check the Dow tonight, remember that you are not just looking at a price. You are wielding a weapon of transparency created by a man who believed that the truth was more powerful than money. The numbers don't lie. They never have. And in the world Charles Dow built, they never will. Thanks for watching, and remember, every number tells a story if you only know how to read it.